The summer of 1940 is remembered in maps and sortie counts in the chalkboards of sector stations and the metallic tang of high-octane fuel around dispersal huts. Southern England became a grid of watchfulness. Fighter Command under Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding divided the sky into sectors controlled from places like Uxbridge and Northolt. The men at the plotting tables moved wooden blocks with croupiers' rakes, while teleprinters chattered and telephones rang out vectors, headings, altitudes, speeds. On the coast, the tall skeletal masts of the chain-home radar network reached into the sky, listening on frequencies civilians never heard, bouncing energy into the air and reading the echoes. Observer Corps posts, wind-bitten, field-glassed, filled in low-level gaps. When the searchlights cooled and the sirens fell silent, the ground crews still worked under blackout hands, slick with oil fitting 303 belts into wings and checking Merlin engines for metal shavings. All of it radar observers, controllers, pilots, functioned as one system, a novel nervous system for a nation under attack. In this crucible, two aircraft types shouldered a mythic weight, the Supermarine Spitfire MQ-9 with its elliptical wings and Rolls-Royce Merlin 45, and the Hawker Hurricane MQ-I, rugged and forgiving, its fabric-covered control surfaces, flexing in high-speed turns. Across the channel, their opponents gathered Messerschmitt Bf-109Es, the swift angular point guards of the Luftwaffe. Twin-engine Bf-110s intended as destroyers but outmatched in tight circles. Heinkel, He-111s, Dornier, Do-17s, and Junkers Ju-88s carrying their bomb loads across the water. RAF brevity codes compressed chaos into syllables bogies, until confirmed bandits once identified, Angels 15 for 15,000 feet, Buster for full power, Vector 070 for a course to steer. A controller's calm voice could sound almost detached when a young pilot barely 20 throttled forward from a grass strip like Biggin Hill. Kenley Tangmere, or North Weald, steer 070 Angels, 15. Bandits 30 miles closing 50 knots. Tally when visual. Then, good hunting. This is the well-documented world, its figures auditable daily loss records, combat reports written in blue-black ink names and serials, and times that historians can triangulate. The Battle of Britain itself has a frame roughly July through October 1940, bookended by operational shifts from convoy raids to airfield attacks to the night blitz. Its cultural resonance is equally documented, a story of endurance, of ordinary people under extraordinary pressure, a nation held together by routines that tasted of tea cordite and fear. Pilots measured time by scrambles and interceptions. Ground crews by turnarounds, civilians by sirens. Newspapers published silhouettes of friend and foe. Wardens told children to keep gas masks close. The language of the fight entered the vernacular and never left. Yet even within this orderly lattice, there were edges, places where the known blurred. Combat at high altitude is a harsh teacher. Oxygen is thin. The sun low over haze or high behind rags of cirrus can turn a canopy into a mirror. Closing speeds in head-on passes approach 600 miles per hour, compressing life and death choices into heartbeats. Gun sight bulbs crack. Condensation blooms across perspex. Tracer arcs distort distance. In the pressure of formation, flying and the mortal tunnel of a dogfight perception is both trained and fragile. Pilots of the era knew this and trained for it. Practice interceptions, deflection shooting instrument scans to counter vertigo. Still in the after-action reports, those laconic RAF Form 541s and 765s, there are occasional marginalia that suggest uncertainty. Unidentified object, bright reflection, unknown light at Angels 20. What we call unidentified flying objects did not belong to the language of 1940 the way it would later in the war when American night fighter crews spoke of Foo Fighters and post-war Scandinavia reported ghost rockets. But the precursor phenomena phantom airships in the years before the First World War, odd lights over battlefields in every age formed a thin cultural sediment. Wartime secrecy thickened it. New technologies, magnetrons, proximity fuses, IFF transponders moved under classification. Rumors filled the gaps. The Luftwaffe and RAF both experimented at the edges of what was then possible. Stories about enemy wonder weapons traveled faster than contrails. Against this backdrop, a pilot's clean, simple statement, "I saw something I cannot explain," stands out not as spectacle, but as a data point inside a system built to record, cross-check, and verify. England's southern counties offered their own peculiar theater. The Channel's glitter could blind at noon and turn ominous at dusk. Thermals over patchwork fields kicked aircraft unexpectedly. Sea haze made objects appear, disappear, and reappear. Temperature inversions bending light, a trick of physics, an experienced aviator learned to respect, but not always to interpret in the few seconds available. In such conditions, radar would declare a plot, a controller would vector a section, and 4 or 6 fighters would climb into the unknown. The result might be an uneventful patrol, a fierce tangle of contrails and cannon fire, or rare and stranger, an encounter that refused to fit the available categories. It is within this calibrated, disciplined world of clipped voices, on RT sector clocks frozen on red, yellow, or blue, and grease-streaked hands turning spanners that one testimony takes on weight. A Royal Air Force pilot trained to report only what he saw, and to separate conjecture from fact, describes a moment in which an enemy aircraft does not fall to his 8 Brownings, nor to a comrade's cannon, nor to mechanical failure he could diagnose. He describes instead a silent metallic disc appearing and vanishing as quickly as a blink, and a German fighter obliterated by something that did not register on any checklist he had ever been given. In that instant, the sturdy lattice of the doubting system meets something outside its design brief, and the line between legend and logbook narrows to a single line of ink. Every conflict breeds stories of the uncanny, and the Second World War was no exception. To understand the strangeness of what one RAF pilot claimed to witness over southern England, we must first attempt to define the shape of the adversary. He described a disc-shaped object, metallic and silent, capable of extraordinary speed and destructive force. Though our language today offers terms like UFO or flying saucer in 1940, no such cultural shorthand existed. Pilots of the period instead relied on technical vocabulary and stark description. In their combat reports, words like disc circular object or unconventional craft surface rarely, but with enough clarity to suggest sincerity rather than embellishment. When building a profile of this phenomenon, we can begin with its described form. Witnesses consistently mention circular or elliptical shapes, often metallic in sheen without visible control surfaces, such as wings or stabilizers. Unlike the sleek but familiar silhouettes of Spitfires or Messerschmitts, these objects exhibited symmetry closer to engineering designs that would not enter aerospace until decades later. They were reported as maneuvering in ways that defied Newtonian mechanics. Abrupt stops, instantaneous accelerations, right-angle turns at high velocity. No piston engine or propeller wash accompanied them. Pilots accustomed to reading an opponent's energy state through engine noise and flight path instead confronted something without precedent. The apparent abilities attributed to such craft formed a catalog both unsettling and strangely consistent across cultures. In the European theater of World War II, American and British night fighter crews began reporting what they called Foo Fighters by late 1944 glowing spheres or disks that paced aircraft, sometimes darting in erratic trajectories, sometimes vanishing as suddenly as they appeared. In Japan, Imperial Army aviators recorded luminous shapes over the Pacific. In later decades, Cold War pilots described metallic disks intercepting reconnaissance missions. The persistence of circular geometry, silence, and instantaneous disappearance ties these otherwise scattered reports into a loose pattern. In the case of the Battle of Britain, what makes the testimony remarkable is its timing so early in the war, before any such folklore had yet permeated pilot culture. It is instructive to compare this adversary with supernatural or mythological beings described in earlier centuries. In Norse sagas, luminous shields appear in the sky. In medieval chronicles, monks note fiery discs during sieges. The Mexican legend of the Nahual speaks of shape-shifting beings who can influence battles through fear and confusion. In Japanese folklore, the Tengu sometimes appear as aerial combatants, tricking warriors into duels that defy earthly rules. Though separated by language and culture, all these beings share traits with the phenomenon. Under discussion, sudden appearance, overwhelming capability, departure without explanation. The difference in the 20th century lies in the technical lens radar plots, gun camera film, and after-action reports anchor what might once have been told only in myth. If we treat the phenomenon as an adversary in the military sense, what rules can we infer? First, its interventions appear rare, unpredictable, and decisive. Unlike human combatants, it shows no need for sustained engagement. Second, its silence, both acoustic and electronic, suggests a complete mastery over detection. Pilots reported no radio interference, no mechanical disruption, only the visual shock of appearance and disappearance. Third, its destructive power is absolute but not indiscriminate. In the 1940 account, the object did not attack Allied aircraft, but obliterated a German fighter. Was this an act of intervention, an accident, or a demonstration? The absence of pattern leaves us with ambiguity, but ambiguity itself becomes part of the adversary's rule set. Weaknesses and taboos, if they exist, remain invisible. Unlike mythic creatures whose vulnerabilities are preserved in story silver, for werewolves, fire for spirits, disc-shaped craft leave no instruction manual. The very lack of residue wreckage or sustained presence denies investigators the forensic evidence on which aviation depends. For this reason, official reports often classified such incidents as inconclusive and moved on. Yet the silence of bureaucracy does not erase the memory of those who saw. Pilots, especially trained to note bearing distance, altitude, and type in split-second observations, rarely confuse a Messerschmitt for a Spitfire or a contrail for a machine. When one says he saw a metallic disc destroy an aircraft, the claim carries a weight distinct from civilian rumor. Placed beside other cultural expressions, the uniqueness of the 1940 encounter sharpens. Unlike later Cold War sightings linked to nuclear installations or space exploration, this event occurred in the crucible of conventional aerial combat. Unlike medieval chronicles, the testimony comes not from monks or chroniclers, but from a fighter pilot accustomed to technological war. Unlike the American Foo Fighters, the British disc did not merely accompany aircraft, but intervened lethally. The convergence of these differences gives the adversary a profile at once familiar in outline and singular in detail. In shaping the narrative, one final contrast is worth noting. Human adversaries are defined by motives, political, territorial, ideological. This phenomenon presents no such motives, only action. The obliteration of a German aircraft in front of a British pilot may tempt interpretations of alliance, punishment, or warning. Yet the absence of subsequent contact or explanation leaves the meaning suspended. What remains is the bare description of a capability, silent appearance, overwhelming force, vanishing. In military analysis, capability without motive is the most unsettling combination of all. It cannot be predicted, bargained with, or planned against. It can only be recorded, remembered, and as we are attempting here, profiled as best the evidence allows. The way legends teach their lessons is through narrative, and in Britain's long history of storytelling, skies and omens have always carried heavy meaning. Among the folk tales woven through the Isles, there is one particularly resonant story that echoes across centuries and provides a kind of blueprint for how to read the RAF pilot's strange account. It tells of a knight in the late medieval era riding home across the downs near Sussex after a battle. Exhausted, bloodied, and carrying the weight of survival, he pauses by a clearing. There, according to the chronicle written decades later, he witnesses a disk of polished metal descending silently from the sky. No sound of wings, no stamp of horses' hooves, only a shimmer in the moonlight. From its surface reflected images of battles past and battles yet to come. His horse panics and bolts. When he returns to the village and recounts what he saw, elders interpret the encounter as both blessing and warning, a reminder that war is never truly in human hands alone. The story became known locally as the Silent Shield, though it never reached the national stage like Arthurian myths. Retelling this myth in full reveals its structure. The knight, weary but unbroken, embodies the figure of the professional soldier, trained, hardened, yet vulnerable to forces beyond his sword. The disc, described in the language of polished bronze or silver, hovers without sound, breaking the rules of what he knows of flight or divine sign. Its silence is not emptiness, but weight, the kind of silence that makes men whisper afterward rather than shout. Its ability to project visions serves a didactic purpose. It shows the warrior that victory or defeat, though claimed by men, is part of a larger theater. Finally, its vanishing restores him to his world, but not unchanged. He carries the image with him as a burden and a lesson. Analyzing this tale, we notice the rules it teaches about contact with such phenomena. The object arrives without warning, engages briefly but decisively, and departs without explanation. It does not linger, nor does it repeat its message. It is up to the human witness to interpret meaning. The knight's elders stress humility, reminding him that warriors may fight and kings may command, but there are forces beyond both. This teaching mirrors what the RAF pilot, centuries later, might have felt. In the cockpit, he fought within the disciplined framework of command and control. But suddenly something appeared that dissolved that framework, forcing him to recognize the fragility of human mastery. Folklorists would argue that the Silent Shield serves as a moral parable about pride. In the medieval worldview, war was never merely material. It was moral, spiritual, cosmic. The disc, descending silently into the knight's life, reminded communities that even in times of triumph, there must be caution and humility. Too often, victory tempts arrogance, and arrogance tempts destruction. To encounter the shield was to be reminded that human agency is bounded, overseen, and sometimes disrupted by powers neither fully benevolent nor malevolent, but utterly indifferent. Comparisons with tales from elsewhere reinforce this interpretation. In Welsh lore, the Cole-Brennan omens of kingship sometimes appeared in the sky before battles, shimmering shields or strange lights promising destiny, but demanding respect. In Norse sagas, warriors described sun shields, fiery discs crossing the heavens before a raid, interpreted as signs that the gods observed and judged. Even in distant Japanese chronicles, samurai occasionally noted Hikari no Tsuba rings of light sword guards in the sky, appearing before decisive battles. Across cultures, circular forms descending from the sky act as warnings and boundary markers. This far may mortals go, but not beyond. The RAF pilot's story, when framed against the silent shield, feels less like an anomaly and more like the continuation of a long cultural pattern. It demonstrates how human beings have always sought to encode the inexplicable within story, to draw rules from the unruly. The silence of the craft, its suddenness, its vanishing, all echo elements of the night's tale. The obliteration of an enemy fighter could be read in folk-tale terms as the vision of destruction projected upon the knight's mind. In both cases, the witness is left shaken, unsure where that the neat geometry of tactics and weapons is easily pierced by a geometry not their own. Folktales like this do not survive because they provide answers. They survive because they provide frameworks. A community can hear them and nod, yes, this is how it happens. Yes, this is how it feels. The Battle of Britain, centuries removed from medieval knights, nevertheless created conditions ripe for such frameworks to be remembered and repurposed. Men thrown into combat against overwhelming odds, straining eyes and engines to the limit, found themselves receptive to the lesson that sometimes the battlefield is visited by presences neither enemy nor ally, but reminders. Reminders that the human struggle, as vast and consuming as it seems, takes place inside a wider, stranger sky. By the time the summer of 1940 reached its fever pitch, Britain itself had become a living front line. Entire counties bristled with hastily erected defenses, pillboxes disguised among hedgerows, barbed wire strung across beaches, anti-aircraft guns stationed on London rooftops. Barrage balloons floated above industrial centers like slow-moving guardians tethered against low-flying bombers. This was a landscape of vigilance, both military and civilian, where every sound overhead carried weight. To place the strange testimony of an RAF pilot within this setting requires us to bridge the historical with the modern, and to appreciate the professional world to which that phenomenon intruded. The men who flew for fighter command were not mystics or dreamers. They were, for the most part, very young men trained in the most rational disciplines available. At the time, mathematics of navigation mechanics of the Merlin engine, the split-second geometry of deflection shooting. Squadron diaries record their days in meticulous detail briefings on fuel load and armament instructions from controllers at Uxbridge or Bentley Priory. The constant rotation between readiness and exhaustion. They lived in a rhythm shaped by machinery and procedure. At dispersal huts scattered along the grass strips of Biggin Hill, Tangmere, and Debden, pilots lounged with mugs of tea waiting for the black phone to ring. When it did, the procedure carried them: scramble, taxi, lift, join formation, follow vector. Their language was clipped, their actions precise. The ethos of professionalism demanded observation without embellishment. To survive, they trusted instruments' doctrine and one another. The environment itself only reinforced this rationality. RAF stations were self-contained machines of war. Control towers pulsed with radio traffic plotting rooms, layered data from radar, and observers' ground crews kept aircraft serviceable with near-mechanical regularity. Within this machinery, there was little space for superstition. If anything, superstition was treated with mild humor, a private comfort for individuals, but not part of the official culture. What mattered was verification. A confirmed kill required either gun camera film, multiple witnesses, or wreckage. A pilot's claim, even when made in earnest, was scrutinized through this framework. It is precisely this culture of skepticism that lends weight to the extraordinary. So when a man raised in rationalism steps outside its boundaries, his words deserve attention. The witness in question, an RAF pilot engaged in a dogfight with a Messerschmitt Bf 109, fit this mold. He was trained to gauge closure rates, estimate angle off fire only when certain of range. Yet, in the middle of that ordered combat geometry, he saw his adversary destroyed not by tracer fire, not by mechanical failure, but by something entirely outside the catalog of possibilities. He described a metallic disc, silent and sudden, appearing almost between breaths. No roar of engine, no contrail, no glint of exhaust flame. Only a shimmer of metal followed by instantaneous obliteration of the enemy aircraft, then disappearance. Such an account delivered in the understated cadence of a combat report shocks by its contrast, the precise language of procedure colliding with the ineffable. The professionalism of other witnesses reinforces this contrast. Radar operators accustomed to filtering static from plots occasionally reported returns they could not classify objects too fast, too erratic, or vanishing altogether. Civil defense wardens, trained to track aircraft silhouettes, sometimes described orbs or discs without wings or fuselage. These individuals were not thrill seekers, but disciplined participants in a national defense apparatus. Their very credibility comes from their skepticism. When such people broke the pattern of understatement to admit confusion, it signaled a moment worth preserving. This bridge between the rational and the irrational also extends into the scientific mindset of the era. By 1940, Britain was at the forefront of technological innovation. Radar cryptography advances in aeronautics. Laboratories in Malvern and Bawdsey worked under strict secrecy, developing equipment that would reshape warfare. Scientists of the period were trained to classify anomalies as experimental or enemy advances, not supernatural visitations. Yet even within these closed circles, rumors circulated about German wonder weapons or British prototypes that seemed too advanced for plausibility. This atmosphere of secrecy necessary for war blurred lines between science fact and science speculation. For a pilot to encounter something inexplicable in combat was to confront the possibility that even the most advanced laboratories had not prepared him for every reality. Thus, when we recount the RAF pilot's testimony of a disc-shaped craft, we must situate it within this professional, rational, and technological world. It was not a peasant seeing a light in the sky. It was a trained combat aviator operating inside a disciplined structure designed to filter rumor from fact. His account, delivered not as folklore, but as a combat observation, unsettles precisely because of the contrast. The modern military world, with its clipped voices and procedural discipline, collided for one instant with something resembling the ancient silent shield of folklore, a presence inscrutable, undeniable, and beyond the rules. This collision, where the technological present is pierced by something older and stranger, provides the necessary frame. The Battle of Britain was not merely a clash of Messerschmitts and Spitfires. It was also, in moments like this, a reminder that beneath even the most rational systems lies a sky that has always harbored mysteries. It is this bridge between the orderly and the uncanny that allows us to enter the heart of the escalation that followed. The day of the encounter begins, like many others, in the late summer of 1940. Squadrons, on readiness controllers, shifting blocks across plotting tables, and the southern sky alive with contrails. Yet within this familiar rhythm, something unfolded that would not be contained by procedures or logbooks. The escalation sequence, when pieced together from testimony and fragments of report, tells of a progression from the strange to the verified, to the psychological, and finally to the climax that left those present unsettled long after the echoes of gunfire had faded. It began with the strange. A section of RAF fighters climbing to intercept bandits, reported at Angels 15, made contact with a formation of BF-109s. Dogfights erupted over the Channel coast, the sky crisscrossed with white streaks, engines straining. One pilot, engaged in a tight turn to shake a pursuer, witnessed his adversary suddenly break away, not to escape, but as if startled by something else entirely. In the periphery of his vision, he saw it a metallic disc, impossibly smooth, catching the sunlight in a way no conventional aircraft could. It hung for a fraction of a second, utterly silent, before accelerating without arc or climb, as though it ignored inertia itself. The pilot's training told him to note details, size bearing relative speed. What he recorded instead was the absence of all ordinary characteristics: no wings, no propeller, no exhaust, just the shape and the silence. Verification came quickly. Other members of the section reported flashes, not of gunfire, but of something luminous near the enemy aircraft. A controller at the sector station noted sudden breaks in combat formation on his plotting table, as if aircraft had dispersed chaotically. Even ground observers watching through binoculars described seeing a bright glint, like a mirror turned suddenly to the sun, before one German fighter disintegrated mid-air without visible cause. In a war where confirmation was paramount, this multiplicity of witnesses prevented the event from being dismissed as one man's hallucination. Yet the phenomenon left no contrail, no wreckage beyond the falling fragments of the destroyed Messerschmitt. Technology and testimony converged to affirm the event, even as explanations slipped away. Then came the psychological assault. Pilots are trained to trust their instruments, their eyes, their instincts sharpened by repetition. But in the aftermath, several men admitted to sensations they could not explain. One described a sudden pressure in his chest, as though the air itself had thickened. Another swore he felt the moment stretch, seconds becoming elongated sounds, muffled except for the engine's vibration beneath him. A third reported a fleeting thought, not his own, but intruding unbidden, that the battle was being watched. None of these impressions could be measured. Yet they echoed across separate debriefs, fragments of the same disquiet. The enemy in that moment was not only the German aircraft, but the very uncertainty of perception itself. The disc had not fired on them, yet its mere presence breached their psychological defenses, leaving them to question not only what they saw, but whether the rules of combat still applied. The climax arrived in an instant, both spectacular and terrifying. The German fighter that had been pursuing the RAF pilot closed the distance cannon shells stitching the air. The British pilot braced for impact, his hand tightening on the spade grip when the metallic disc reappeared, this time between hunter and hunted. There was no blast, no arc of tracer, only a sudden corona of light around the disc. The Messerschmitt disintegrated wings shorn away. Fuselage collapsing fragments scattering across the sky. In the pilot's logbook, he would later write simply, "Enemy aircraft destroyed by unknown agency." To him the kill did not belong, could not belong to his own guns. In the fraction of a heartbeat, the disc vanished again, leaving only silenced debris and stunned survivors circling the sky. After the battle back on the ground, the men tried to anchor themselves in procedure. Aircraft were checked, fuel-tallied, guns rearmed. Reports were filed. Yet the atmosphere in the dispersal hut carried a weight different from exhaustion. They had fought the Luftwaffe before, and would again. But this encounter pressed against something deeper. In the official paperwork, the details might be reduced to enemy aircraft, destroyed with no elaboration. In the privacy of conversation, however, the pilots exchanged glances and fragments. "Did you see it too?" It wasn't ours. It wasn't theirs. Their language, so precise in combat, faltered here. For once, words failed men who normally described sky speed and death with mathematical clarity. The escalation sequence closes with silence. No further appearances, no follow-up. The disc entered the battle, altered it irrevocably, and then vanished. What remained was not wreckage to analyze, but memory to wrestle with. The strange had become verified, the verified had become psychological, and the psychological had climaxed into something bordering on myth. Yet the men involved were not poets or storytellers. They were trained aviators whose survival depended on precision. Their inability to contain the event within procedure is itself the most powerful testimony that what they saw and felt was real, even if beyond explanation. In every culture, when events refuse to yield to ordinary explanation, people turn to figures of wisdom, those who carry memory, perspective, and the ability to weave fragments into meaning. In Britain during the war, this role was not always filled by generals or politicians. Sometimes it was the chaplain at a squadron station, sometimes an elderly village historian, sometimes a retired aviator from the previous generation who had lived through the first war in the air. When younger pilots described the unexplainable disc that had entered their battle, such figures became natural recipients of the story interpreters who could connect what had happened in the sky to older frameworks of human understanding. One such voice belonged to a veteran of the Royal Flying Corps, now in his 60s, who visited a fighter command station during those dark months. He had flown biplanes of wood and fabric over the mud of France, where he too had witnessed lights that seemed to hover above the trenches, moving without sound. To the young men gathered around him, he spoke not in the clipped brevity of controllers, or in the bureaucratic tone of reports, but in the cadence of reflection. The sky, he told them, has always belonged to more than just us. When men first looked up, they saw omens. When I flew over Ypres, I saw things I could not name. You have seen your own. Do not dismiss it, but do not be consumed by it either. The sky tests us, but it also reminds us that we are part of something greater than our wars. His words acted as a synthesis. He did not claim knowledge of machines beyond human design. Nor did he deny what the pilots had seen. Instead, he framed it as a reminder of humility, a lesson carried in every age. He cited history as proof. Ancient chronicles of fiery shields in the sky. Monks recording discs of light above battlefields. Sailors describing luminous wheels upon the sea. What you saw, he said, is not new. It is as old as our fears and our hopes. Perhaps it watches us, perhaps it warns us, perhaps it is indifferent. What matters is that it exists beyond our control. That knowledge is sobering, but it is also liberating. For it means we are not alone in this vast theater, though we may never know our company. Philosophers of the time too grappled with similar notions. The war forced existential questions upon everyone. What does it mean to fight for survival when the universe remains silent about its intentions? A theologian writing in 1940 reflected that unexplained phenomena in war might serve as mirrors held up to the soul of mankind, reminding us that our conflicts are but ripples on a deeper ocean. This sentiment, though, couched in religious language, paralleled what the pilots felt when their ordinary geometry of combat was interrupted. The appearance of the disc was not just an event, it was a confrontation with the limits of human mastery. The wise elder character in this context becomes both literal and symbolic. He is the retired airman, the chaplain, the historian, the philosopher, each providing the lens through which raw testimony can be understood without being dismissed. His voice is one of balanced respect for the witness, caution against easy conclusions, and reverence for the mystery itself. He does not exploit the story for sensation, but preserves its dignity, anchoring it in the continuity of human experience. His synthesis acknowledges that while aircraft may be destroyed and battles may be won or lost, the larger meaning remains suspended, awaiting interpretation. For the pilots, such reflections offered a strange comfort. They could return to their cockpits confident again in their procedures and comradeship, yet carrying with them the awareness that the sky was layered. It contained the known patterns of radar plots and vector headings, but also the unknown, which demanded humility. In that humility lay resilience, the understanding that survival was not only about speed, firepower, or tactics, but also about recognizing one's small place in a vast, indifferent, perhaps even watchful cosmos. Through this synthesis, the account of the metallic disc transcends categories. It is not merely an anomaly in a combat report, nor merely a folktale retold in modern garb. It becomes part of a continuum of human attempts to reconcile the rationale with the inexplicable. The wise elder, in speaking with measured reverence, provides not closure, but depth, reminding both witnesses and later generations that the unexplained is not a flaw in the world, but part of its design. In his presence, the pilot's confusion transforms into a kind of solemn awe, a recognition that their fight was but one thread woven into a larger, stranger tapestry. When all the accounts are assembled, the historical context, the careful profiling of the phenomenon, the echoes of old legends, the testimony of professional witnesses, the escalation into something beyond comprehension, and finally, the sober reflections of elders. What remains is not a solved mystery, but an open field of questions. That RAF pilot writing his terse report in the middle of 1940 could never have imagined that decades later people would still examine his words for meaning. Yet the survival of his testimony tells us something important. Even in the most rational, documented, and deadly environments, the unexplained persists. The investigative journey we have traced is both precise and fragile. We have followed the authority of history, the doubting system, the sector stations, the Spitfires and Messerschmitts locked in mortal struggle. We have followed the rules of narrative, the strange, the verified, the psychological, and the climactic. We have followed the words of those who try to synthesize meaning, refusing either dismissal or sensationalism. But at the end of that path lies a silence, the same silence that hovered in the sky above southern England, when a disc appeared destroyed an aircraft and vanished. That silence is the heart of the matter. Was the object a prototype weapon decades ahead of its time? Was it a misperception amplified by the stress of combat? Was it an expression of the same phenomenon that monks and knights once described in chronicles and folktales? Or was it something entirely beyond human frameworks, indifferent to the categories of technology, myth, or psychology? We cannot answer definitively. And perhaps that is why the story matters more now than if we could. Because unanswered questions drive communities like ours, the seekers, the investigators, the ones unwilling to file an extraordinary testimony away under inconclusive and forget it. Each account, however fragmentary, adds to a map of human experience that stretches across centuries and cultures. The RAF pilot's words stand beside Norse sagas, medieval chronicles, night fighter reports, and Cold War testimonies. They remind us that mystery is not an interruption of history, but part of its fabric. For the viewer of this documentary, the call to action is not about belief or disbelief. It is about attention. Pay attention to the margins of history where facts blur into something harder to categorize. Pay attention to the dignity of witnesses who risked ridicule to put their experiences into words. Pay attention to the way ancient folk tales echo in modern testimonies, as though humanity has always been trying to describe the same silent intrusions. And finally, pay attention to your own sky, whether it is clouded or clear, whether you watch it from a city street or a quiet field. For the phenomenon, whatever its nature, has always chosen moments of vulnerability, moments when the ordinary is pierced by the extraordinary. The Battle of Britain is remembered for its bravery, its losses, its decisive importance in the course of the war. But within its vast archive, there is also this quieter story of a man in a cockpit, seeing something that broke every rule he had learned and surviving to write it down. That act of reporting honestly what was seen, even when it made no sense, becomes a legacy in itself. It challenges us to do the same, to notice, to remember, and to share. The mystery remains open, as it should. To close it would be to diminish it. Instead, we let it breathe. Let it unsettle, let it remind us that history is never only what we already understand. The disk over southern England, metallic and silent, may have vanished in a blink, but its impression endures, calling each of us to remain alert, humble, and curious. And in that curiosity, we become part of the same long lineage of seekers, stretching back to knights, monks, aviators, and now you. The story is not finished. It is ongoing, written in every watchful gaze that turns upward.